The moment Keisha Williams stepped into Lincoln High's most notorious classroom, she knew they were waiting for her to break, but they had no idea she'd been forged in fire long before she ever picked up a piece of chalk. The morning mist clung to Lincoln High School's weathered brick facade like a reluctant shroud, and Keisha Williams stood at the edge of the parking lot, her leather satchel gripping her shoulder the way determination gripped her heart. At 28, she'd already survived 3 school districts, each one testing her resolve in ways that had nothing to do with lesson plans and everything to do with proving she belonged behind a teacher's desk. Her fingers traced the small scar above her left eyebrow, a souvenir from her teenage years in Chicago, back when survival meant knowing when to fight and when to disappear. The morning sun caught the gold threading in her navy blazer, professionally tailored but practical enough to move in. Most people saw the polished exterior, the neat natural hair, the confident stride, the warm smile that could disarm even the surliest administrator. They didn't see the black belt certificate rolled carefully in her bottom drawer, or the hours she still spent at Master Chen's dojo, throwing grown men twice her size onto practice mats. "You sure about this placement, Williams?" Principal Henderson had asked 3 days ago, sliding her file across his desk. "Room 237 is challenging. We've gone through 4 teachers this semester." Keisha had met his gaze steadily. "I didn't come here for the easy assignments, Mr. Henderson." Now, walking through Lincoln's halls, she caught fragments of whispered conversations that followed her like smoke. The building itself seemed to hold its breath, lockers slamming with unusual force, sneakers squeaking against linoleum with deliberate loudness. She'd learned to read the signs, the way students' eyes tracked her movement, the subtle shift in their postures when she passed. Some looked curious, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. Room 237 sat at the end of the mathematics hallway like a trap waiting to spring. Through the wire-reinforced window, she could see them already assembled, 15 students who'd been branded as difficult, unmotivated, problematic. The kind of labels that followed kids like shadows, growing longer and darker with each passing year. What drives someone to teach the unteachable? She wondered, knowing her own answer ran deeper than any education degree could explain. Inside the classroom, 17-year-old Tyler Morrison slouched in the back corner, his Letterman jacket hanging loose over shoulders that had already learned to carry more weight than any teenager should bear. His father's voice still echoed in his ears from breakfast. "You embarrass this family one more time with your grades, boy, and you'll be looking for somewhere else to live." Tyler's eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter ice, surveyed his kingdom of misfits. There was Jessica, whose cutting remarks could slice through steel; Marcus, whose silence masked intelligence he'd learned to hide; and Destiny, whose anger burned so bright it could light up the whole school. They weren't friends exactly, but they were united by something stronger than friendship, the shared knowledge that adults had already given up on them. "So we got ourselves a new teacher," Tyler murmured to the group, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned leadership in the wrong places. "Question is, how long before this one runs crying to Henderson like the rest?" The classroom door had become a revolving entrance for substitute teachers, each one arriving with fresh hopes and leaving with broken spirits. Mrs. Patterson had lasted 3 weeks before a strategically placed tack in her chair sent her to the nurse's office and then to an early retirement. Mr. Rodriguez had made it almost a month until his car tires were slashed and his resignation letter appeared on Henderson's desk the next morning. But there was something different about the woman they'd glimpsed in the hallway. She didn't walk like someone who scared easily. "Maybe she'll be different," Destiny offered quietly, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it herself. Tyler's laugh was bitter. "They're never different. They come in here thinking they're gonna save us, change us, fix us. Then they realize we don't want to be saved." The clock above the whiteboard ticked toward 8:15, each second stretching like a held breath. Outside, the morning fog was beginning to lift, revealing a day that would change everything for everyone in room 237. Jessica traced patterns on her desk with her fingernail, her mind wandering to the college brochures hidden in her locker, dreams she'd learned to keep secret because hoping hurt too much when disappointment was guaranteed. Marcus flipped through a tattered paperback, his eyes moving across words that transported him away from the suffocating expectations of a classroom where being smart was seen as betrayal. And in the back corner, Tyler Morrison sat coiled like a spring, ready to prove once again that some kids were just too broken to fix. None of them knew that their new teacher had spent the weekend reviewing not just their academic files, but their disciplinary records, their family situations, their unspoken hungers for something more than the low expectations that had been handed to them like participation trophies. The doorknob turned with a soft click that sounded like a starting gun. "What do you think makes the difference between a teacher who gives up and one who fights for her students?" Share your thoughts about what real strength looks like in education. Keisha Williams entered room 237 like she was walking into a courtroom where she was both defendant and prosecutor. The door closed behind her with finality that seemed to echo off the scuffed walls covered in motivational posters that had been defaced with creative profanity. "Good morning," she said simply, setting her satchel on the desk with deliberate care. No forced enthusiasm, no nervous energy, just presence. Her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made people lean in rather than tune out. The silence stretched like a taut wire. 15 pairs of eyes studied her with the intensity of predators sizing up prey, looking for weakness, for the telltale signs of fear that had marked every teacher who'd stood in that exact spot before her. Tyler Morrison shifted in his seat, the metal legs scraping against linoleum like fingernails on a chalkboard. "So what's your story, Teach?" "Here to save us all with the power of mathematics." Instead of the defensive reaction they expected, Keisha smiled, not the plastic smile adults used when they were trying too hard, but something genuine and slightly amused. "I'm here to teach algebra. Whether you learn it or not is entirely up to you." The unexpected response created a ripple of confusion. Teachers were supposed to beg them to pay attention, to threaten them with consequences, to launch into speeches about their potential. This woman just existed in the space, comfortable with their hostility like she'd been expecting it. "That's it." Jessica's voice dripped with skepticism. "No big speech about how we're all special snowflakes who just need someone to believe in us." "Nope." Keisha began writing on the whiteboard, her handwriting neat and confident. "You're not special. You're human beings with brains that work just fine when you choose to use them." 4:43 minutes, something unprecedented happened in room 237. Actual teaching occurred. Not because the students had suddenly transformed into model pupils, but because Keisha refused to engage in the power struggles that had derailed every previous class. When Tyler made sarcastic comments, she acknowledged them and moved on. When Marcus actually answered a question correctly, she didn't make a big show of it. When Destiny slammed her textbook shut in frustration, Keisha simply continued explaining quadratic equations like nothing had happened. The class was beginning to settle into an unfamiliar rhythm when the door burst open. 3 seniors entered without permission: Brad Martinez, Kevin Thompson, and their leader, Jake Sullivan, whose father sat on the school board and whose sense of entitlement had been polished to a high shine by 18 years of never facing real consequences. Well, Jake drawled, his voice carrying the particular brand of cruelty that came from knowing the system would protect him. "Looks like Lincoln finally hired some diversity for the math department." The classroom temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every student in room 237 had been the target of Jake's particular brand of torment at some point, but this felt different. More dangerous. Keisha's hand stilled on the whiteboard. She turned slowly, and Tyler noticed something shift in her posture. Not fear, but a subtle change in balance, like a boxer settling into her stance. "Gentlemen, you're not enrolled in this class," she said evenly. "I'll need you to." "What you need," Jake interrupted, stepping closer, "is to understand how things work around here. See, we heard Lincoln hired a new teacher who thinks she can handle the problem kids." His smile was shark-like. "But maybe someone should handle you first." Brad snickered. "Yeah, show her the Lincoln High Welcome Committee." The moment crystallized into something sharp and inevitable. Keisha recognized the setup. She'd seen it before in Chicago, in Detroit, in every school where her presence challenged assumptions about who belonged behind a teacher's desk. They wanted her to cower, to call for help, to prove she was just another frightened substitute who would disappear by Christmas. Instead, she set down her marker and faced them fully. "You have 3 seconds to walk out of my classroom," she said quietly. 1. Jake laughed and took another step forward. "Or what? You gonna call Principal Henderson? Gonna run crying about the mean students?" 2. Kevin moved to flank her from the left, while Brad positioned himself near the door, a coordinated effort that spoke of practice. The students in room 237 sat frozen, recognizing predatory behavior but powerless to stop it. Tyler Morrison found himself half rising from his seat, something protective flaring in his chest that he didn't fully understand. 3. Jake lunged forward, reaching out to grab her arm in a gesture designed to intimidate and dominate. What happened next took less than 2 seconds, but would replay in everyone's memory for years to come. Keisha's right hand intercepted Jake's wrist with surgical precision while her left palm struck his chest. She pivoted on her back foot, using his own momentum against him, and suddenly Jake Sullivan, 6'2" and captain of the wrestling team, was airborne. He hit the floor with a sound like a thunderclap, the breath knocked completely from his lungs. Brad rushed forward to help his friend and found himself face down on the linoleum beside Jake before he could process what had happened. Kevin, showing more wisdom than his companions, froze mid-step with his hands raised. The classroom was silent except for Jake's wheezing attempts to breathe. Keisha smoothed her blazer and picked up a marker as if nothing had happened. Now then, where were we? Oh yes, solving for x when the coefficient is negative. Tyler Morrison stared at his new teacher with something approaching awe, watching her return to the equation on the board while two of Lincoln High's biggest bullies groaned at her feet. This woman just changed everything, he thought, and for the first time in months, he opened his notebook and actually started taking notes. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone stood up to bullies in an unexpected way? What do you think goes through a person's mind when they decide to fight back instead of backing down? Drop your thoughts below. The silence that followed the confrontation lasted exactly 17 seconds. Tyler had counted, his eyes never leaving his teacher's face as she calmly resumed writing equations on the board. Then Jake Sullivan managed to roll over with a groan that seemed to snap everyone back to reality. You can't. Jake wheezed, struggling to his feet while Brad remained sprawled on the floor, staring at the ceiling like he was questioning every life choice that had led him to this moment. My father will hear about this. You assaulted students. Keisha didn't turn around. I defended myself against 3 individuals who entered my classroom without permission and attempted to physically intimidate me. Her voice remained steady, professional. There's a difference. Kevin helped Brad to his feet, both of them eyeing the door like rabbits contemplating their escape route. But Jake, his face flushed with humiliation and rage, wasn't ready to retreat. This isn't over, he snarled, jabbing a finger toward Keisha's back. You have no idea who you're messing with. Now she did turn, and something in her expression made all 3 seniors take an involuntary step backward. Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. The question is whether you do. After the 3 had stumbled out, Kevin practically dragging Jake, who was still muttering threats, the classroom remained electric with tension. The students of room 237 sat in stunned silence, their minds rewriting everything they thought they knew about power dynamics and adult authority. Jessica was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Holy shit. Language, Miss Rodriguez, Keisha said mildly, still facing the board. But I understand the sentiment. Tyler found himself caught between admiration and something that felt dangerously close to hope. All his life, adults had either cowered before bullies or become bullies themselves. He'd never seen someone stand their ground with such calm precision, turning aggression back on itself like a mirror reflecting sunlight. But hope was a luxury Tyler Morrison couldn't afford. He'd learned too well that moments of triumph were usually followed by devastating consequences. You know they're going straight to Henderson, right? He said, his voice carrying the bitter wisdom of someone who'd watched the system crush anyone who dared to fight back. Jake's dad practically owns this school. They'll have you fired before lunch. Keisha finally turned to face the class, leaning against her desk with an ease that suggested she wasn't worried about administrative retaliation. Let me worry about Mr. Sullivan Sr. You worry about whether you understand the quadratic formula. But Tyler wasn't ready to let it go. Something about this woman's unshakable confidence both inspired and terrified him. You don't get it. This is how it works here. People like Jake, people like his family, they win. They always win. And people like... He gestured vaguely at the classroom, at himself, at her. People like us, we survive by not making waves. The pain in his voice was raw, unguarded, and it made Destiny look up from her desk where she'd been pretending to doodle while processing what she'd just witnessed. She recognized that particular brand of hopelessness, the kind that came from watching good people get destroyed for standing up. Maybe that's the problem, Destiny said quietly, surprising herself with the words. Maybe that's why nothing ever changes around here. Marcus, who'd been silent since the confrontation, finally spoke up. My uncle was a teacher in Atlanta. Said the hardest part wasn't the kids who acted out, it was the ones who'd given up believing things could be different. Keisha studied each of their faces, seeing past the defensive postures and careful indifference to the hunger underneath, the desperate want to believe that someone, somewhere, would finally refuse to back down. You know what I think, she said, moving away from the board to perch on the edge of her desk. I think you're all scared that I'm going to disappoint you. That I'm going to be just like every other adult who promised to be different and then crumbled the first time things got difficult. The accuracy of the observation hit like a physical blow. Tyler felt his jaw clench, while Jessica's eyes narrowed with the defensive anger of someone whose emotional walls had just been breached. Don't, Jessica warned, her voice sharp. Don't pretend you know us. Don't pretend you're different. Teachers always think they're gonna save us, and then. I'm not here to save you, Keisha interrupted gently. I'm here to teach algebra. The saving part? That's your job. The bell rang, signaling the end of first period, but nobody moved. The weight of what had happened, and what was still happening, kept them anchored to their seats. Tyler gathered his books slowly, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to warn her about what was coming, about the phone calls that were probably already being made, about the way the system would close ranks against her. But another part of him, a part he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed, wanted to see what would happen if just once, just this once, the good guy didn't back down. As students began filing out, Destiny paused at the door. Miss Williams? For what it's worth, that was the most educational thing that's happened in this classroom all year. Keisha smiled. The day's still young, Miss Parker. Alone in her classroom, Keisha walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. She could see Jake Sullivan pacing back and forth near his BMW, phone pressed to his ear, gesticulating wildly. Brad and Kevin flanked him like bodyguards, still looking shell-shocked. Her phone buzzed. A text from Principal Henderson. My office. Now. Keisha Williams straightened her blazer, picked up a lesson plan, and walked toward what she knew would be the first real test of her resolve. Behind her, the equations on the whiteboard remained unsolved, waiting for someone brave enough to work through the variables and find the answer. In his locker, Tyler Morrison slammed his textbook shut so hard it echoed through the hallway like a gunshot, the sound expressing everything he couldn't put into words about wanting something he was afraid to believe in. Principal Henderson's office felt like a tribunal chamber, complete with uncomfortable wooden chairs positioned to make visitors feel small and defensive. Keisha sat with perfect posture, her hands folded calmly in her lap while Henderson shuffled through a stack of papers with the theatrical precision of a man who'd perfected the art of administrative intimidation. Across from her, Jake Sullivan occupied the chair like a throne, his father's expensive lawyer flanking him with briefcase and legal pad at ready. The elder Sullivan, board member, major donor, and walking embodiment of institutional privilege, stood behind his son with the satisfied air of a man who'd never lost a battle that mattered to him. Miss Williams, Henderson began, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone forced to handle an unpleasant but necessary task. We have a serious situation here. Yes, we do, Keisha agreed quietly. 3 students disrupted my class and attempted to physically intimidate me. I'm prepared to file a formal incident report. The lawyer cleared his throat. My client and his friends entered the classroom to welcome a new teacher and were met with unprovoked violence. We have witnesses. The witnesses were the students in my class, Keisha replied evenly. 15 of them saw exactly what happened. Henderson's expression suggested he found this detail inconvenient rather than exonerating. Miss Williams, the students in room 237 have credibility issues. Their testimony wouldn't carry much weight in any formal proceeding. The casual dismissal of her students' voices hit Keisha like a slap. She'd expected the politics, the institutional protection of privileged students, but the naked contempt for the kids she'd just spent an hour teaching caught her off guard. So their word means nothing, she said, not quite a question. Let's focus on solutions, Sullivan Sr. interjected smoothly. My son is willing to accept an apology. We understand that new teachers sometimes feel overwhelmed. I'm not apologizing for defending myself. The words hung in the air like a challenge nobody had expected. Henderson shifted uncomfortably, clearly hoping for a quick resolution that would make his Monday morning return to normal. Miss Williams, perhaps you don't understand the gravity of the situation. Physical contact with students, regardless of circumstances, is grounds for immediate termination. However, given that this is your first day, we're prepared to be flexible. In exchange for an acknowledgement that you overreacted, commitment to anger management counseling, and a transfer to Lincoln Elementary, where your teaching style might be more appropriate. Keisha felt the familiar weight of institutional racism settling over her shoulders like a lead blanket, the same feeling she'd experienced in Chicago when they'd suggested she be happier at a different school, in Detroit when they'd questioned her cultural fit after parents complained about her high expectations. She was forming her response when the office door burst open. "Mr. Henderson." Tyler Morrison stood in the doorway, breathing hard like he'd run the entire length of the school. Behind him clustered the rest of room 237. Jessica, Marcus, Destiny, and a dozen others, their faces flushed with determination and barely controlled anger. "Mr. Morrison, this is a private meeting." "No, it's not," Jessica stepped forward, her usual sarcasm replaced by fierce protectiveness. "This is about our teacher, and we have something to say." Henderson's face reddened. "You students need to return to class immediately, or you'll all face suspension." "Then suspend us," Destiny said quietly. "But we're not leaving until you hear what really happened." The room crackled with tension. Sullivan Sr. whispered urgently to the lawyer, while Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly not expecting his victims to mount a defense. Tyler stepped forward, his voice steadier than Keisha had ever heard it. "Jake Sullivan and his friends came into our classroom to mess with Miss Williams. They surrounded her, got in her face, and Jake grabbed her arm. She defended herself. That's what happened." "These students are hardly reliable witnesses," the lawyer began, but Marcus interrupted. "I recorded it." He held up his phone, screen facing the room. "Audio's a little muffled, but you can hear everything. Jake threatening her, Miss Williams asking them to leave, the whole thing." The silence that followed was deafening. Henderson stared at the phone like it was a ticking bomb, while Sullivan Sr.'s confident expression cracked slightly around the edges. That doesn't change anything," Jake sputtered. "She still assaulted us." "After you grabbed her," Jessica shot back. "Which, last I checked, is also assault." Keisha watched the power dynamics shift in real time. These students, her students, had walked out of their classes, risked suspension, and stood up to the most powerful family in the district to defend her. The magnitude of their courage, especially knowing how the system typically treated kids like them, left her momentarily speechless. Henderson cleared his throat, clearly recalculating his position. "This is irregular. Students shouldn't be involved in." "We're already involved," Tyler said firmly. "Miss Williams is our teacher. What happens to her happens to us." The words carried weight that surprised everyone in the room, including Tyler himself. For the first time in his academic career, he felt ownership over his education, protectiveness toward an adult who treated him like a human being worthy of respect. Sullivan Sr. stepped forward, his political instincts recognizing a losing battle. "Perhaps we should table this discussion until you can figure out how to spin it." Destiny's voice cut through his diplomatic deflection. "We know how this works. Rich kid causes trouble, poor kids get blamed, and the teacher who stood up gets fired." Henderson looked around the room, at the determined faces of students he'd written off, at the phone that contained evidence he couldn't ignore, at a new teacher who'd somehow inspired unprecedented loyalty in less than 2 hours. "Everyone out," he said finally. "Miss Williams, you'll remain on duty pending a full investigation. Students, return to your classes immediately." As they filed out, Tyler caught Keisha's eye and nodded once, a gesture of solidarity that said more than any speech could have conveyed. Walking back toward room 237 together, the group moved with the quiet satisfaction of people who'd just discovered their own power. The remainder of the school day passed in a strange bubble of heightened awareness. Word of the confrontation had spread through Lincoln High's hallways like wildfire, creating an electric undercurrent of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Keisha found herself the subject of intense scrutiny from both faculty and students, some curious, others skeptical, a few openly supportive. By lunch, she'd received 3 text messages from other teachers offering solidarity, 2 emails from parents demanding her removal, and 1 anonymous note slipped under her classroom door that simply read, "Thank you for not backing down." Tyler Morrison spent his lunch period in the library, not because he enjoyed reading but because he needed quiet space to process what had happened. The memory of standing up to Henderson, of speaking truth to power without his voice shaking, felt foreign and exhilarating. He'd spent so many years perfecting the art of invisibility that visibility felt like wearing someone else's skin. "Didn't expect to find you here." He looked up to see Keisha Williams standing beside his table, a brown bag lunch in one hand and a worn paperback in the other. Without waiting for invitation, she sat across from him, her movements carrying the same calm confidence she displayed in Henderson's office. "Most teachers eat in the faculty lounge," Tyler said, not quite accusingly but not welcoming either. Most teachers didn't just have their students risk suspension to defend them, she replied, unwrapping a sandwich. Seemed like the least I could do was share lunch with the ringleader. Tyler's jaw tightened. I'm not a ringleader. Those guys had no right to treat you like that. Keisha studied his face, the careful set of his shoulders, the way his hands remained flat on the table like he was ready to push away at any moment. She recognized the posture of someone who'd learned that caring about people was a dangerous luxury. Tell me about your father, she said quietly. The question hit like a physical blow. Tyler's carefully constructed mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something raw and vulnerable before sliding back into place. What about him? The way you talked about people like Jake's family always winning, that came from somewhere specific. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the library table's scarred surface. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My dad was a mechanic. Good one, too. Honest. Fixed cars for half this town, including the Sullivans. He paused, the memory clearly painful. 3 years ago, Jake's dad brought in his Mercedes. Dad found out the brake system was defective, manufacturer recall that Sullivan either didn't know about or ignored. Dad told him it was dangerous, that he needed to take it to the dealer immediately. Keisha waited, sensing there was more. Sullivan said he didn't have time for dealer service. Told my dad to just patch it up temporarily. Dad refused, said he wouldn't put his name on work that could get someone killed. Tyler's voice grew harder. So Sullivan took his business elsewhere. And then he made some phone calls. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. Within a month, Dad lost 3 major contracts. The garage started hemorrhaging money. Sullivan and his friends spread word that my father was unreliable, overpriced, difficult to work with. Tyler's hands clenched into fists. By Christmas, we'd lost everything. House, business, everything. Keisha felt something cold settle in her stomach. Where's your father now? Construction site outside Memphis. Sends money when he can, but it's not enough. I live with my grandmother, work nights at the gas station to help with rent. Tyler's laugh was bitter. And Jake Sullivan still drives that Mercedes. Never did get those brakes fixed properly. The weight of his story hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Keisha reached across the table and placed her hand over his clenched fist, a gesture of connection that made Tyler's breath catch. That's why you expected me to back down, she said, understanding flooding her voice. Because you've seen what happens to people who don't. Tyler nodded, not trusting his voice. Keisha took a breath, making a decision that went against every professional boundary she'd ever been taught. Can I tell you something I've never told any student before? He looked up, curiosity overriding his defensiveness. I wasn't always a teacher. 5 years ago, I was a social worker in Chicago. Had a caseload of kids who'd been written off by everyone. Kids in foster care, juvenile detention, kids who'd been failed by every system designed to help them. She paused, her fingers unconsciously moving to the small scar above her eyebrow. There was this one kid, Marcus, 14 years old, smart as hell but angry at the world. His foster father was, let's call him what he was, a predator. I reported it, followed protocol, did everything by the book. Her voice grew quiet. But the foster father had connections. Money. Lawyers who knew how to make inconvenient accusations disappear. Tyler found himself leaning forward despite himself. Marcus was moved to a different home, officially for behavioral issues. I was reassigned to a different district. Case closed. Problem solved. Keisha's hand moved to her scar again. Except Marcus ran away from the new placement. Found my apartment one night, bloody and desperate. The new foster father had been worse than the first. What did you do? I broke about 15 regulations and let him stay the night. Patched him up, fed him, called in every favor I had to find him a safe placement. She smiled sadly. It worked. Marcus is in college now, studying engineering. But I lost my job, my professional reputation, my apartment when the board found out what I'd done. Tyler stared at her with new understanding. That's why you became a teacher. That's why I learned judo first, she corrected. Then became a teacher. I decided that if I was going to keep fighting for kids the system had abandoned, I better know how to fight for myself too. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, but neither of them moved. Miss Williams. Tyler's voice was uncertain. What you did for Marcus, was it worth it? She smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her all day. Ask me that question again in June, Tyler. When you're walking across the graduation stage. The afternoon brought an unexpected shift in room 237's atmosphere. Word of the morning's events had spread beyond the school walls, creating a strange bubble of protection around Keisha and her students. Parents who'd initially called for her removal found themselves arguing with their own children at dinner tables. Teachers who dismissed room 237 as a lost cause began paying attention to the sounds coming from behind that door, not chaos, but actual learning. Keisha had restructured her lesson plan entirely, abandoning the traditional approach that had failed so many teachers before her. Instead of lecturing from the front of the room, she moved among the desks, treating each student like a collaborative partner in solving mathematical puzzles. Destiny, walk me through this equation, she said, stopping beside the girl's desk where a complex quadratic waited half-solved. Destiny looked up, suspicion warring with something that might have been curiosity. I got stuck on the negative coefficient part. Show me where you got stuck. For the next 10 minutes, the entire class watched as Keisha guided Destiny through the problem, not giving answers, but asking questions that led to understanding. When Destiny finally solved it herself, her face lit up with genuine surprise. I actually got it, she murmured, staring at her work like it had appeared by magic. You always had it, Keisha replied quietly. You just needed someone to stop talking long enough for you to think. Tyler found himself actually engaging with the material for the first time in months. The algebra that had seemed impossibly abstract suddenly felt like a code worth cracking, especially when Keisha connected it to real-world applications that mattered. Anyone know why quadratic equations matter outside this classroom? She asked. Marcus raised his hand tentatively. Architecture? Like, figuring out the curve of a bridge. Exactly. What else? Basketball, Tyler said without thinking, then caught himself. I mean, the arc of a shot follows a parabola, right? Keisha's smile was brilliant. Physics, trajectory, optimization. You're thinking like mathematicians. The transformation wasn't just academic. As the week progressed, something deeper began shifting in the dynamics of room 237. Students who'd spent years protecting themselves through aggression or withdrawal started taking small risks, asking questions, offering answers, even helping each other when Keisha wasn't looking. On Thursday, Jessica stayed after class. Miss Williams. Her voice carried none of its usual edge. Can I ask you something personal? Keisha looked up from her desk where she was grading papers. Shoot. That story you told Tyler about the social worker job, did you ever regret it? Giving up your career for one kid. The question hung between them, loaded with Jessica's own unspoken fears about the cost of caring too much. Every day for about 6 months, Keisha admitted. I felt stupid, naive, like I'd thrown away everything I'd worked for. Then Marcus sent me his first college acceptance letter. Jessica nodded slowly. I got accepted to State. Full scholarship for journalism. But I haven't told anyone because... She trailed off, vulnerability making her voice small. Because if you say it out loud, it becomes real. And real things can be taken away. Yeah. Jessica's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. What if I'm not smart enough? What if I get there and realize I don't belong? Keisha set down her pen and gave Jessica her full attention. What if you get there and realize you're exactly where you're supposed to be? The conversation that followed lasted an hour, touching on imposter syndrome, the weight of being first-generation college-bound, and the courage required to claim a future that felt impossibly big. When Jessica finally left, she was carrying herself differently, straighter, more purposeful. Friday brought an unexpected gift. Tyler arrived early to class, as had become his habit, but instead of sitting silently until others arrived, he approached Keisha's desk. I wanted to thank you, he said awkwardly. Not just for standing up to Jake and his crew, but for... He gestured vaguely at the classroom, at himself. For making me remember that I'm not stupid. You were never stupid, Tyler. You were surviving. My dad called last night, he continued, his voice growing stronger. First time in 2 months. Said he might be able to come back for my graduation if I actually graduate. Are you going to? Tyler's smile was the first genuinely hopeful expression she'd seen from him. Yeah, I think I am. As other students filtered in, the classroom felt different than it had just 5 days earlier. Destiny and Marcus were bent over a homework problem together, their usual antagonistic dynamic replaced by genuine collaboration. Jessica was reading aloud from a college brochure to anyone who'd listen. Even the quieter students seemed more present, more engaged. Okay, people, Keisha called the class to attention. Pop quiz time. The collective groan was theatrical rather than genuinely distressed. Relax. It's not graded. I just want to see how much you've absorbed this week. What followed was 20 minutes of students who'd been labeled as unmotivated and unteachable, demonstrating not just mathematical competency, but genuine enthusiasm for learning. Problems that would have been met with sullen silence a week earlier sparked animated discussions about methodology and alternative solutions. When the quiz was over, Tyler raised his hand. Miss Williams, can I ask you something? Always. Why didn't you just apologize to Henderson and take the transfer? Would have been easier. The question drew the attention of every student in the room. They'd been wondering the same thing, afraid to voice their curiosity about why this particular adult had chosen to fight for them. Keisha looked around the classroom, at faces that had become familiar, precious, and felt something shift in her chest. These weren't just students anymore. They were her kids, and she'd walk through fire before she'd abandon them. Because easy isn't always right, she said simply. And you're worth the fight. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of words that had never been spoken to most of them before. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, and Keisha couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile new bond was about to be tested in ways none of them were prepared for. Think about a teacher or mentor who believed in you when others didn't. What difference did that belief make in your life? Share your story. We all need reminders about the power of someone refusing to give up on us. Monday morning arrived like a cold slap of reality. Keisha pulled into Lincoln High's parking lot to find news vans clustered around the main entrance like vultures, their satellite dishes reaching toward a grey sky that seemed to mirror her sinking stomach. A reporter was already doing a live broadcast, gesturing toward the school building with a theatrical concern reserved for stories involving troubled youth and classroom violence. Her phone had been buzzing since 6 a.m. with missed calls from district administrators, local news outlets, and numbers she didn't recognize. The voicemail she'd managed to listen to painted a clear picture. The story had gone viral over the weekend, thanks to strategically edited security footage that somehow made her defensive actions look like unprovoked aggression. Lincoln High teacher attacks students in shocking classroom incident, read the headline on her phone screen. The accompanying video, grainy and without audio, showed only the moment of physical contact. Jake hitting the floor, Brad following, with no context of what had led to the confrontation. Tyler Morrison saw the news trucks from his grandmother's front porch and felt his world tilt on its axis. He'd spent the weekend feeling something foreign and dangerous. Hope. Hope that things could be different, that adults could be trusted, that maybe his senior year wouldn't be just about surviving until graduation. Now, watching reporters set up their equipment to tear down the first teacher who'd ever made him believe in himself, that hope curdled into familiar rage. By first period, room 237 felt like a war zone. Half the usual students were absent. Their parents had pulled them out, afraid of guilt by association. Those who remained sat in stunned silence, watching their teacher move through her morning routine with mechanical precision while protesters gathered outside the windows with signs reading "Protect our children" and "Zero tolerance for violence." Miss Williams, Destiny's voice was small, uncertain. Are they going to fire you? Keisha set down her marker and turned to face her students. Fewer now, but still hers. I don't know, Destiny. But whatever happens, I need you to remember something. You are brilliant, capable, and worthy of every opportunity this world has to offer. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The words sounded like a goodbye, and everyone in the room knew it. At 9:47 a.m., Principal Henderson appeared in the doorway with 2 security guards and a woman in an expensive suit who screamed District Legal Counsel. Miss Williams, I need you to come with us. Tyler shot to his feet. This is bullshit. She was defending herself. Mr. Morrison, sit down or you'll be suspended. Then suspend me. Tyler's voice cracked with emotion. Suspend all of us. Because if she goes, we're done pretending any of this matters. One by one, the remaining students in room 237 stood up. Jessica, Marcus, Destiny, even quiet Sarah Chen, who never spoke above a whisper. They formed a protective barrier around their teacher's desk, their young faces set with determination that would have been admirable if it wasn't so futile. "Students, return to your seats immediately," the legal counsel ordered. "This is a personnel matter that doesn't concern you." "It concerns us plenty," Jessica shot back, her journalist instincts fully engaged. "Funny how there's no footage of Jake and his friends threatening her, or him grabbing her arm. Almost like someone edited the video to tell a specific story." Henderson's face reddened. "That's enough. All of you, report to the office for insubordination." "No." The single word came from Marcus, spoken so quietly it barely carried across the room. But the weight of it, the absolute refusal to comply, made everyone freeze. "I said no," Marcus repeated, louder now. "I'm not leaving Miss Williams. None of us are." What followed was 15 minutes of the most heartbreaking defiance Keisha had ever witnessed. Her students, kids who'd been failed by every system, who had every reason to protect themselves first, stood their ground against overwhelming authority. They were suspended one by one, escorted from the classroom by security guards, but not before each one looked back at her with eyes that said, "This isn't over." Tyler was the last to go. As the security guard reached for his arm, he turned to Keisha with an expression of such raw betrayal that it nearly broke her heart. "You said you wouldn't back down," he said, his voice thick with accusation and grief. "You said we were worth fighting for. Tyler. Save it." His laugh was bitter, familiar, the sound of someone whose hopes had been crushed too many times to count. "I should have known better. Adults always leave when things get hard. Always." The door slammed behind him, leaving Keisha alone with Henderson, the legal counsel, and the echoing weight of Tyler's words. "This is for the best," Henderson said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it. "The district can't afford this kind of publicity." Keisha began packing her personal items, a photo of her parents, the black belt certificate she'd hung behind her desk, the small stack of college brochures Jessica had left for her to review. Each item felt like a small death, a dream deferred. "The students will be fine," the legal counsel added with corporate efficiency. "We'll have a permanent substitute by tomorrow. Will you?" Keisha's voice was steady, professional. "Because those kids weren't fine before I got here, and they won't be fine after I leave. They'll be exactly what everyone expects them to be: statistics, cautionary tales, proof that some kids just can't be saved." She shouldered her bag and walked toward the door, pausing only once to look back at the whiteboard where Friday's equations remained unsolved. In the hallway, she could hear the sounds of normal school life continuing: lockers slamming, students laughing, teachers calling for attention. But from the administrative office came the sounds of conflict, raised voices, slammed doors, and Tyler Morrison's grandmother demanding to know why her grandson had been suspended for standing up for his teacher. Keisha Williams walked out of Lincoln High School the same way she'd entered it 5 days earlier, alone, determined, and carrying the weight of other people's expectations. But now she also carried something else: the knowledge that she'd found 15 kids worth fighting for, and the devastating certainty that she'd failed them when they needed her most. Outside, the news vans were already packing up, moving on to the next story, the next controversy. The protesters had dispersed, their signs stacked neatly in car trunks like weapons returned to storage. By noon, room 237 was empty except for a substitute teacher who would spend the rest of the semester trying to maintain order among students who had learned, once again, not to trust adults who promised to stay. 3 weeks later, Keisha Williams sat in a coffee shop in downtown Memphis, staring at a contract for a position at a private academy 90 miles away from Lincoln High. The salary was better, the students came from families who valued education, and there would be no news vans or viral videos to complicate her life. It was everything she should want: safety, stability, respect. So why did it feel like surrender? Her phone buzzed with another text from her mother. "Honey, that Memphis job sounds perfect. Sometimes you have to know when to walk away." But walking away had never been Keisha's strength. Even now, fired and professionally blacklisted in 3 counties, she couldn't stop thinking about Tyler's face when the security guard had led him from her classroom. The betrayal in his eyes had haunted her dreams for weeks. She tried reaching out: phone calls that went to voicemail, texts that remained unread, even a visit to the gas station where he worked nights. But Tyler Morrison had learned his lesson about trusting adults who made promises they couldn't keep. He disappeared back into the protective shell of cynicism that had kept him safe before she'd arrived to complicate his carefully managed expectations. The coffee shop door chimed, and Marcus Washington walked in, scanning the room until his eyes found hers. At 17, he carried himself with a dignity that reminded her why she'd become a teacher in the first place. Behind him came Jessica, then Destiny, then 3 more students from room 237. "Miss Williams," Marcus said formally, approaching her table. "We need to talk." They arranged themselves around her like a war council, their faces serious but no longer defeated. Something had changed in them during the weeks since her dismissal, a hardening, but also a focusing of purpose. "We know about the job offer," Jessica said without preamble. "Memphis Academy. Congratulations." Keisha set down her coffee, surprised. "How did you?" "I'm going to be a journalist, remember? I know how to find information." Jessica's smile was sharp. "Question is, are you going to take it?" "It's a good opportunity," Keisha replied carefully. "Teaching kids who actually want to learn, parents who support education." "Kids who don't need you," Destiny interrupted. "Kids who'll succeed with or without a teacher who gives a damn." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Keisha felt the familiar weight of guilt settle across her shoulders, the same feeling that had driven her to take the Memphis position in the first place. "I can't help you anymore," she said quietly. "I'm radioactive. Any school that hires me risks protests, negative publicity." "We're not asking you to come back to Lincoln," Marcus said. "We're asking you to stop running." Tyler Morrison materialized at her elbow like a ghost, his face gaunt with exhaustion but his eyes burning with something she hadn't seen since that first day in her classroom: hope. "Tyler." His name escaped her lips like a prayer. He slid into the chair beside her, close enough that she could see the new scar on his knuckles, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Heard you were leaving town," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The Memphis job is bullshit, and you know it." Tyler's anger was quiet, controlled, but absolute. "You think we haven't been paying attention these past 3 weeks? You think we don't know what you gave up for us?" Jessica leaned forward. "We did some digging into Jake Sullivan's family. Turns out his father has a history of making problems disappear for the right price. Teachers, coaches, anyone who doesn't play by his rules. We also found out about the video editing," Marcus added. "District IT guy has a gambling problem. Sullivan Sr. paid off his debts in exchange for some creative editing work." Keisha stared at them, these kids she'd underestimated from the very beginning. "You've been investigating." "We've been learning," Destiny corrected. "All that stuff you taught us about solving for X? Turns out it applies to more than just algebra." Tyler reached into his backpack and pulled out a thick folder. Witness statements from every student who was in room 237 that day. Audio recording Marcus made. Security footage from a hallway camera that shows Jake and his friends planning the whole thing before they came in. Plus, Jessica added with obvious pride, a letter-writing campaign from parents and community members who are tired of the Sullivan family running this town like their personal kingdom. Keisha's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Page after page of evidence, testimony, and support, all compiled by teenagers who should have been focused on homework and college applications instead of fighting institutional corruption. "Why?" she whispered. "Why go through all this trouble?" Tyler's voice was steady, mature in a way that broke her heart. "Because you taught us that some things are worth fighting for. That walking away isn't the same as being smart. That maybe, just maybe, the good guys can win if they're willing to stand up long enough." He paused, his eyes meeting hers directly. "You taught us not to give up. So we're not giving up on you." The coffee shop fell silent except for the hiss of the espresso machine and the distant hum of traffic. Keisha looked around the table at these young faces, scarred, determined, brilliant, and saw herself reflected in their refusal to accept defeat. "The district will never take me back," she said finally. "Too much bad publicity, too many burned bridges." "Maybe not the district," Marcus agreed. "But there's more than one way to teach." Jessica slid a business card across the table. "Community Learning Center. They're looking for someone to run their GED and college prep programs. Kids who've dropped out, adults going back to school, people who need a second chance." "People like us," Destiny added softly. Tyler leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "So what's it going to be, Miss Williams?" "Memphis Academy, where you'll be safe and comfortable and slowly die inside." Or are you going to remember why you became a teacher in the first place? Outside the coffee shop window, the sun was setting over a city full of kids who needed someone to believe in them. Inside, Keisha Williams held a folder full of evidence and a business card that felt like a lifeline. The choice, she realized, had never really been a choice at all. 6 months later, the Memphis Community Learning Center buzzed with a kind of energy that came from people who'd been given a second chance and refused to waste it. The converted warehouse space bore no resemblance to Lincoln High's sterile hallways. Exposed brick walls were covered with student artwork, mismatched furniture created cozy learning nooks, and the sound of animated discussions replaced the oppressive silence of institutional education. Keisha Williams stood at the front of what had once been the building's loading dock, now transformed into her classroom. 23 students ranging in age from 16 to 43 filled the space, some working on JEDs, others preparing for college entrance exams, all united by the determination to prove that potential has no expiration date. "All right, people," she called, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had served her well at Lincoln. "Final presentations start in 5 minutes. Remember what we discussed about confidence. You know this material better than you think you do." Tyler Morrison, now 18 and officially her teaching assistant, moved through the room with quiet competence, helping students set up their presentation materials. The angry, defeated boy who'd sat in the back corner of room 237 had transformed into a young man who carried himself with purpose. His acceptance letter to Memphis State hung framed on the wall, the first in a collection that grew weekly. Miss Williams, called Maria Santos, a 30-year-old mother of 3 who'd returned to school after a decade away. "I'm still nervous about the statistics portion." "Walk me through it," Keisha replied, settling into the chair beside Maria's desk. "What's the first step when analyzing a data set?" As Maria worked through the problem, Tyler noticed Jessica Rodriguez entering through the main door, her press credentials from the Memphis Tribune hanging around her neck. She'd driven down from college to cover the center's 6-month anniversary, and to see the woman who'd changed her life receive the Community Educator of the Year award. The presentations that followed were a testament to human resilience. Marcus Washington, who'd graduated high school with honors and was now majoring in engineering, had volunteered to mentor younger students. He presented research on educational equity that would have impressed graduate students. Destiny Parker, working toward her GED while raising her newborn daughter, delivered a powerful speech about breaking cycles of poverty through education. When the last presentation ended, Keisha felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with watching students exceed their own expectations. This was why she taught, not for the test scores or administrative approval, but for moments like these when human potential bloomed despite every obstacle placed in its path. "Miss Williams." Tyler approached as students were packing up. "There's someone here to see you." She looked toward the entrance and froze. Principal Henderson stood awkwardly by the door, looking as out of place in the vibrant learning center as an undertaker at a wedding. Beside him, surprisingly, stood Jake Sullivan. But this wasn't the arrogant teenager who'd burst into her classroom 6 months earlier. Jake's expensive clothes had been replaced by simple jeans and a t-shirt, and something fundamental had changed in his posture, a humility that spoke of hard-won lessons. "Miss Williams," Henderson began formally. We came to apologize." The room fell silent. Students who'd been gathering their belongings stopped to listen, sensing the weight of the moment. Jake stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something. What happened in your classroom? It wasn't random. My father, he paid me and my friends to disrupt your class, to make you look bad so you'd quit or get fired." The admission hung in the air like a confession at church. Jessica's journalistic instincts kicked in as she quietly activated her phone's recording app. "He was afraid," Jake continued, his voice growing stronger. "Afraid of what you represented. A teacher who wouldn't back down, who actually cared about kids he'd written off. He thought if he could get rid of you, things would go back to normal." Tyler moved closer to Keisha, his protective instincts still sharp after all these months. "So why tell us now?" Jake's laugh was bitter. "Because normal sucks. My father's been indicted for fraud. Turns out bribing teachers was just the beginning. And I've been in therapy, trying to figure out why I let him turn me into someone I hate." Henderson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The district would like to offer you your job back, Miss Williams. Full reinstatement, back pay, and a formal apology for how you were treated." The offer everyone had been waiting for finally materialized, but Keisha felt no surge of vindication, no desire for revenge. She looked around the learning center, at Maria Santos helping another student with math, at Marcus mentoring a teenage father, at Tyler organizing materials with the efficiency of someone who'd found his calling. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said quietly. "But I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The principal blinked in surprise. "But this is what you wanted. Vindication. Your reputation restored." "What I wanted was to teach kids who needed me," Keisha interrupted gently. "Turns out those kids aren't all in traditional classrooms." Jake looked around the center with something approaching wonder. "They told me you were trouble. That you didn't understand how things work." "Maybe I didn't," Keisha agreed. "Or maybe I understood too well." As Henderson and Jake prepared to leave, Jake turned back one final time. "For what it's worth, that day in your classroom. It was the first time anyone had ever stood up to me. Made me realize I could choose to be better." After they'd gone, the room gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Students resumed their conversations, Tyler returned to grading papers, and Jessica interviewed Maria about her journey back to education. But Keisha remained by the window, watching the sun set over Memphis and thinking about the strange paths that led people to where they needed to be. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother, saw the news about the job offer. "Proud of you for whatever you decide." Tyler appeared at her shoulder. "Any regrets?" She looked around the room, at students who'd been told they were too old, too poor, too far behind to matter, now discovering their own brilliance. At walls covered with acceptance letters, GED certificates, and artwork created by people rediscovering their potential. "None," she said, and meant it completely. That evening, the Community Learning Center hosted its first graduation ceremony. 12 students received JEDs, 8 earned college prep certificates, and everyone, students, families, and teachers, celebrated the radical idea that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. As Tyler Morrison walked across the makeshift stage to accept his teaching assistant certification, he caught his former teacher's eye and mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Keisha Williams smiled, knowing that some victories are measured not in vindication or revenge, but in the quiet triumph of refusing to give up on the people everyone else had written off. Outside, Memphis sparkled with possibility, and tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that education isn't about buildings or bureaucracy, it's about believing in human potential even when that belief requires a fight. The girl from Chicago who'd learned to throw grown men onto practice mats had become a woman who could lift fallen spirits back to their feet. And that, she realized, was the only victory that had ever really mattered.